like to tell you a little bit of how I have transformed as a person, I would say. So I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, actually in the country, not in a rural setting, outside a very small town. I was pretty isolated from what was going on in the world. I do remember my mother worked as a domestic for some people, and she would bring home Life magazines. And I can remember flipping through the Life magazines and seeing, so this was in the late 50s, seeing the protests and the things that were happening in the South with trying to integrate the schools. But I was completely isolated from that. I knew nobody who was of a different color than I was. I grew up in a very Republican household, and I was a WASP, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And even when I went to college, that really didn't change. I went to a small college in Western Pennsylvania. Graduated in 1966. I was a teacher and taught for several years. Met my husband, we got married, and we decided to move to Delaware because he was a teacher also, and teachers were being paid better in Delaware than they were in Pennsylvania at that time. We had a child and moved here in 1969. I started substituting and, kind of just led the life of a stay-at-home mom with one child. I got involved with the Girl Scouts as a volunteer. I had never been a Girl Scout, but I thought they were a good idea. I was a leader with the Girl Scouts. In 1977, I had a second child, a boy, and I was very active as a volunteer, and that led then to a job with the Girl Scouts. And that was the first transformation of my life. I started working for the Girl Scouts in, let's see, I think it was probably about 1984 or 83. And the Girl Scout organization is very interested in spreading Girl Scouting to all groups of people. Ethnic minorities, low income, high income. So I was, for the first time, working with people of color and serving girls. We were running programs in parks. I was going into the parks where I was the only white person. So that was a new experience. I didn't find it frightening. I found it kind of exhilarating. And the other thing is that Girl Scouts provided training, not only for volunteers, but especially for staff, in diversity. And I learned so much about my biases and my language and what it meant. So that was my first transformation. I left the Girl Scouts in 1991 and went to work for an organization called Family and Workplace Connection. And in that role, I worked with child care providers. But the really transformation was in that the executive director was very liberal and very knowledgeable about political issues. So for the first time, I kind of became aware of the political arena. This was the Clinton era, and so this was when there was a lot of reform in the social support systems, the aid to families with children, the food programs, all those programs. And I think the thing that my director said that kind of had the biggest impact on me as a WASP, I guess, was it's okay for poor women to work, but not for rich women. That's the perception. Rich women, or middle-class women, they should be home taking care of their children. But we don't want to support poor women. They should be working. And that, it kind of opened my eyes to how we dealt with the differences in the economic spectrum. So I left there in 1997 and the other thing about being there is we had really good conferences with really good speakers that also continued to educate me on how you could be an advocate, which was a role I never particularly liked or took on. So in 1997, I left there and came here. I had always wanted to be the leader of a nonprofit. My experience had always been with nonprofit, and I saw myself as a nonprofit manager. I got a lot of good education when I worked for the Girl Scouts. And I was really excited when this job opened up, and the fact that I could apply for it. It was in my backyard. It was leading an organization that I saw could be growing. And although it was a very different population from what I had been working with, youth and daycare providers and that, I was fortunate to get the job. And as I said, it was really the beginning of the turning around of this organization. Things kind of moved along, and I would say the next kind of transformation in my life was 9/11 and then the subsequent war with Iraq. That was really the first time that I became kind of more politically involved. Not to the fact that I would actually do something, except I did change my registration. I'd always been Republican, and I could not support the Republican Party and the president. So for me, it was a big step. I changed my registration and became a Democrat. I guess since then, I left the center in 2006 because my husband became ill, and I wanted to be able to be with him, and then he subsequently passed away in 2007. I was very fortunate after that to get involved with a program at Temple University called Coming of Age. That one of the goals of that program was to introduce nonprofits to the skills of the older person, and also to help the older person recognize their skills and what they had to give to the nonprofits. I did that for about a year or so, and that kind of led into workshops for senior centers. I am more politically aware, although I have not been politically active. Although if things continue the way they are, I may become more politically active. I've worked for local campaigns, but I've never done anything on the national. I've worked distributing flyers and that kind of thing, and making phone calls, but I've never been active on the national scene. So I wrote this one time at a class for information for a class reunion. I left my hometown as a conservative Republican, and now I'm a liberal Democrat.